The rain hammered down on the cracked pavement of downtown Detroit like 1,000 tiny fists, each drop a reminder that the world had grown cold and unforgiving. Beneath the flickering neon sign of a closed pawn shop, a young woman named Keisha Williams huddled against the brick wall, her worn jacket doing little to protect her from the November chill. At 23 years old, she was 7 months pregnant, her swollen belly pressing against the thin fabric of her dress. Her dark eyes, once bright with dreams, now carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Keisha had been homeless for 4 months. Ever since her foster mother, Mrs. Patricia Green, had thrown her out of the only home she'd ever known. The accusation still rang in her ears like a death sentence. "Witch, devil's child, you brought darkness into my house." It had started innocently enough. Keisha had always possessed an unusual sensitivity, a gift she'd inherited from her grandmother, a woman she'd never met, but whose stories had been whispered to her by the few relatives who'd bothered to visit before disappearing from her life entirely. She could sense things, feel the energy of people around her, know when something terrible was about to happen. 3 months before her expulsion, Mrs. Green's husband, Robert, had been complaining of chest pains. The doctors had dismissed it as indigestion, prescribed antacids, and sent him home. But Keisha had felt it, a dark shadow creeping around his heart like ivy strangling a tree. She'd told Mrs. Green, begged her to take him back to the hospital, insisted that something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Green had waved her off, called her dramatic, told her to stop inventing problems where none existed. 2 weeks later, Robert Green collapsed in the kitchen and died before the ambulance arrived. Massive heart attack. The autopsy revealed severe blockages that had gone undetected. Instead of recognizing that Keisha had tried to warn them, Mrs. Green's grief twisted into rage. How had Keisha known? What kind of unnatural power did she possess? The whispers started at the funeral, spread through their Southside neighborhood like wildfire. The girl who predicted death, the one who sees things no Christian should see. Within days, Mrs. Green packed Keisha's few belongings into garbage bags and left them on the curb. "You cursed him!" Mrs. Green had screamed, her face contorted with pain and fury. "You spoke death over my husband, and now he's gone. Get out! Get out and take your demons with you." Keisha had tried to explain, tried to make her understand that she'd been trying to help, trying to save him. But grief doesn't listen to reason, and fear doesn't care about truth. She'd gathered her bags, walked away from the only stable home she'd known in her 23 years, and never looked back. That was when she discovered she was pregnant, a parting gift from Marcus, the boyfriend who'd vanished the moment she told him about the baby. Now, 4 months later, Keisha survived on the kindness of strangers and the occasional meal from a soup kitchen on Gratiot Avenue. She learned which alleys were safest to sleep in, which park benches the police didn't patrol too heavily, which store owners would let her use the bathroom without calling security. Her gift, the very thing that had cost her everything, continued to manifest in strange ways. She'd touch someone's hand while accepting spare change and suddenly know they were sick, know exactly what herbal remedy would help them, see visions of roots and plants she'd never studied but somehow understood. She'd helped a homeless veteran named Curtis with his chronic pain by directing him to find wild burdock root growing near the river. She'd told a runaway teenager named Jasmine about passion flower tea to calm her anxiety attacks. Word spread among Detroit's invisible population, the forgotten souls who lived in the margins. Some called her a healer. Others still whispered the word witch, but with less venom, more curiosity. Keisha didn't care what they called her. She just knew that when she helped someone, when she eased their suffering even slightly, it made her own pain more bearable. The dreams had started 3 weeks ago. Every night, the same vision played behind her closed eyelids with cinematic clarity. A man in his early 50s, African-American, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Keisha had earned in her entire life. His face was handsome but carved with worry, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Beside him stood a girl, 18 or 19 years old, seated in a state-of-the-art wheelchair. She had her father's features, the same intelligent eyes, but they carried a profound sadness that made Keisha's heart ache. In the dream, Keisha always approached them in a place filled with trees and autumn colors, a park or garden of some kind. The man looked at her with a mixture of hope and desperation. The girl in the wheelchair reached out her hand, and Keisha heard her own voice, clear and confident, saying words that made no logical sense. "I can help her walk. I know how to heal what the doctors cannot fix." She'd wake up with tears streaming down her face, her hand protectively cradling her belly, wondering if pregnancy hormones were making her lose her mind. But the dreams persisted, growing more vivid, more urgent. She began to feel a pull, an inexplicable magnetic force drawing her away from the familiar streets of Detroit's east side towards somewhere unknown. The sensation was so strong that one morning she simply started walking. For 3 days, Keisha followed this invisible thread, sleeping in bus shelters, accepting rides from sympathetic truckers, moving steadily northwest. She had no money, no plan, no rational explanation for what she was doing. The homeless people thought she'd finally cracked, wandering off on some delusional quest. But Keisha had learned to trust the knowing that came from somewhere deeper than logic, the same knowing that had tried to save Robert Greene, that helped Curtis and Jasmine, that whispered secrets about healing plants and human suffering. The pull led her to Birmingham, an affluent suburb north of Detroit that might as well have been another planet. Tree-lined streets gave way to sprawling estates, hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Keisha felt absurdly out of place, a pregnant homeless black woman shuffling through a neighborhood where even the squirrels probably had trust funds. Security cameras tracked her movements. A few residents stared from their luxury vehicles, expressions ranging from pity to disgust. She found herself drawn to a particular park, an exquisitely maintained public space with walking trails, ornamental gardens, and a large fountain surrounded by benches. It was late afternoon, the October sun casting golden light through the changing leaves. Keisha's feet ached, her back throbbed, and the baby kicked restlessly inside her. She sank onto a bench near the fountain, closed her eyes, and for a moment allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she wasn't hungry and scared and alone. When she opened her eyes, they were there. The man from her dreams walked along the path, pushing the wheelchair that carried his daughter. Every detail matched perfectly, from the cut of his suit to the particular shade of sadness in the girl's eyes. Keisha's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled. This was impossible. Dreams didn't manifest in reality. Coincidences didn't align this perfectly. Yet here they were, exactly as she'd seen them night after night. The man was James Morrison, though Keisha didn't know that yet. At 52, he'd built Morrison Tech Solutions from a garage startup into a billion-dollar cybersecurity empire. He owned 3 homes, employed over 5,000 people, and had been featured in Forbes, Fortune, and every major business publication. But none of his wealth, none of his success, none of his connections to the most brilliant minds in medicine could give him the one thing he wanted most in the world: to see his daughter walk. Alicia Morrison was 19 years old and had been confined to a wheelchair since birth. She'd undergone countless examinations, consultations with specialists from Johns Hopkins to Mayo Clinic, experimental treatments that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The diagnosis was always the same. Her legs were perfectly formed, her muscles intact, her nerves seemingly functional, but they wouldn't work. Medical science offered no explanation, no solution. Some doctors suggested psychosomatic causes, which only infuriated James. His daughter's condition wasn't in her head. It was real, devastating, and apparently permanent. James came to this park every Saturday afternoon when he was in town, a ritual he and Alicia had maintained for years. It was one of the few places where she seemed at peace, where the pressure of being James Morrison's daughter lifted slightly. He'd push her wheelchair along the paths, and they'd talk about everything except the thing that haunted them both: her inability to walk, to run, to dance, to live the full life she deserved. As they approached the fountain, James noticed the young woman on the bench. Her condition was immediately apparent: homeless, pregnant, exhausted. His heart clenched with automatic sympathy. He'd grown up poor on Detroit's west side, knew what hunger felt like, what it meant to be invisible to people with means. Despite his wealth, he'd never forgotten those years, and he made a point of seeing people that others walked past. He steered Alicia's wheelchair toward the bench and smiled at Keisha. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right? Can I help you with anything?" Keisha's voice caught in her throat. This was the moment from her dreams, the convergence point that had pulled her across miles of uncertainty. She met James's eyes and saw genuine concern there, not the judgment or fear she'd grown accustomed to receiving. She began, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell this wealthy stranger that she'd dreamed about him and his daughter, that she'd walked for days following a mystical pull she couldn't name, that she somehow knew she could help his daughter when the world's best doctors had failed? James waited patiently. Alicia studied Keisha with curiosity, but no hostility. Something about the girl's gaze made Keisha feel seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in months. "I'm hungry," Keisha finally admitted, choosing the simplest truth. "And tired. I've been walking for a long time." James nodded immediately. "There's a cafe right across the street. Let me buy you some food, please. I insist." 20 minutes later, Keisha sat at an outdoor table with a hot sandwich, soup and tea in front of her. James had also given her a $100 bill, which she'd tried to refuse, but he'd pressed it into her hand with the kind of gentle firmness that didn't accept no for an answer. Alicia's wheelchair was pulled up to the table, and the girl sipped her own coffee while watching Keisha with an expression that seemed almost knowing. As Keisha ate, James made polite conversation, asking nothing invasive, offering no judgments. But Alicia suddenly spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I dreamed about you." James turned to his daughter, confused. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Alicia's eyes never left Keisha's face. "For the past few weeks, I've been dreaming about a woman who looks exactly like her. In my dreams, she tells me she can help me, that she knows something the doctors don't." The teacup shook in Keisha's hands. James stared at his daughter, then at Keisha, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder to define, something between hope and fear. Keisha set down her cup and looked directly at James Morrison. "I can help your daughter walk. I know that sounds insane. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I've seen it, felt it, know it with absolute certainty. There's a way, and I can show you." The words hung in the air like a prayer or a threat, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to accept at face value. The silence that followed Keisha's declaration stretched like a tightrope, taut and trembling with possibility. James Morrison had built an empire on calculated risks, on reading people and situations with precision honed over 3 decades of business. He'd heard countless pitches, identified genuine innovation amid oceans of snake oil, separated dreamers from doers with almost surgical accuracy. But this moment defied every analytical framework he possessed. A homeless pregnant woman he'd met 5 minutes ago was claiming she could heal his daughter when neurologists at Massachusetts General, orthopedic surgeons at Johns Hopkins, and specialists from Switzerland to Singapore had all thrown up their hands in defeat. Logic screamed at him to smile politely, wish her well, and walk away. Yet something in her eyes stopped him cold, something that reminded him uncomfortably of his own grandmother, a woman from rural Alabama who'd been called a root worker, who'd known things she had no business knowing, who'd predicted his father's business failure 3 months before it happened. How? The word came out rougher than James intended. How could you possibly help her when doctors who've dedicated their entire lives to medicine can't even diagnose what's wrong? Keisha glanced at Alicia, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to intense focus. Your daughter's condition isn't physical in the way they're testing for. The nerves that control her legs aren't damaged, but they're sleeping, dormant, like a circuit that has all the right wiring but needs a specific frequency to activate. There's a plant, a root that grows in specific conditions that can wake those nerves up, strengthen the connection between her brain and her legs. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. A root? You're telling me that after I've spent over $2 million on medical care, flown my daughter to 6 different countries, consulted with 53 specialists, the answer is a plant? Not just any plant, Keisha continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. It's called Solomon's seal root. Native Americans used it for exactly this purpose, for nerve damage and paralysis that Western medicine doesn't understand. But it has to be the right variety, harvested at the right time, prepared in a specific way. I can see it, feel how it needs to be done. Alicia reached out and touched her father's arm. Dad, remember what Grandma Rose used to say about plants being medicine before medicine was medicine? James's jaw tightened. His grandmother Rose had been a constant source of embarrassment during his climb up the corporate ladder, with her herb gardens and folk remedies and unshakable belief in healing that couldn't be quantified in clinical trials. He'd spent years distancing himself from that background, building a reputation based on technology, innovation, and modern solutions. Now, his daughter was asking him to circle back to the very worldview he'd abandoned. Alicia, sweetheart, we can't just... He began, but she cut him off. I've dreamed about her for 3 weeks, Dad. 3 weeks of the same dream, every single night. That doesn't happen randomly. And she's had the same dreams about us. What are the odds of that? Alicia turned to Keisha. You saw this park in your dreams, didn't you? The fountain, the maple trees, everything? Keisha nodded slowly. I saw him pushing your wheelchair along that exact path. I heard myself saying I could help you. The dreams were so real that I walked from Detroit following nothing but a feeling that I needed to be here. I had no money, no plan, no reason, except that the dreams wouldn't stop. James ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight of impossible decisions. His security team would tell him this was insane. His personal physician would warn against unproven treatments. His board of directors would question his judgment if word got out that he'd trusted his daughter's health to a homeless woman claiming mystical knowledge. But when he looked at Alicia, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope lighting up her face like sunrise. If I even consider this, James said carefully, I need more than dreams and intuition. Walk me through exactly what you're proposing. Every detail. For the next 20 minutes, Keisha explained what she knew with a clarity that surprised even herself. The knowledge flowed like water from a spring she hadn't known existed inside her. She described the specific subspecies of Solomon's seal root, how it needed to be combined with milk thistle and ashwagandha in precise ratios, steeped in a particular way to extract the compounds that would stimulate dormant neural pathways. She explained that Alicia would need to drink the preparation twice daily for 7 days, that her body might react with deep sleep as it redirected energy toward healing, that the process wouldn't be instant, but would be unmistakable. James listened with the intensity he brought to billion-dollar negotiations. He pulled out his phone and began fact-checking details, discovering that Solomon's seal root was indeed used historically for nerve issues, that recent studies had identified compounds with neural regenerative properties, that traditional medicine had documented cases of paralysis treatment using similar herbs. None of it was definitive, but it wasn't pure fantasy either. "Where would you even find these plants?" James asked. "I'm not about to let you wander around foraging in random places and feeding my daughter whatever you dig up." "That's the strange part," Keisha admitted. "I keep seeing them in a garden, a very specific garden with stone walls and formal beds. Not wild, but cultivated, somewhere close to where you live." James's eyes widened slightly. His Bloomfield Hills estate had extensive gardens designed by his late wife, Diane, who'd been passionate about medicinal plants and historical landscaping. She died 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and James had kept the gardens maintained as a memorial, though he rarely walked through them anymore. Could the plants Keisha described actually be growing there? Planted by Diane years ago for purposes he'd never fully appreciated. "Come with us," Alicia said suddenly. "Come to the house. Let's see if the plants are there." "Absolutely not," James replied automatically. "I don't know anything about her." "This could be what, Dad? A scam? What's she going to steal? Plants from the garden?" Alicia's voice carried an edge he rarely heard from his gentle daughter. "We've tried everything else. Everything. And all it's gotten me is 19 years in this chair. I'm not asking you to let her treat me right this second. I'm asking you to see if the plants are there. If they're not, fine, we walk away. But if they are, if everything she's describing actually exists in Mom's garden, doesn't that mean something?" The mention of Diane shifted something in James's chest. His wife had believed in the intersection of traditional wisdom and modern medicine, had spent hours researching ethnobotany and historical healing practices. He'd indulged her interest but never shared it, viewing it as a harmless hobby. What if it had been more than that? What if Diane had been preparing something he was only now able to see? James looked at Keisha, really looked at her. She was terrified, he realized. Despite her confident words, she was shaking, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. She wasn't performing or manipulating. She was as confused by this convergence as he was. "If I take you to my home," James said slowly, "you understand that my security team will be present. If anything seems dangerous or wrong, you'll leave immediately. And if we do proceed with any kind of treatment, my daughter's doctor will monitor every step. Those are non-negotiable conditions." Keisha nodded vigorously. "I understand. I'm not trying to replace doctors. I'm just offering something they haven't considered." 30 minutes later, Keisha found herself in the back seat of a Mercedes SUV that cost more than most houses, driving through gates that opened onto an estate that looked like something from a movie. The main house was a modern masterpiece of glass and stone, but Keisha's attention was drawn to the gardens that sprawled across the grounds in intricate patterns of beds, pathways, and stone features. James's head of security, a stern-faced man named Marcus Bradley, had run Keisha's identification and found exactly what she'd told them. No criminal record, no history of fraud, just a series of foster placements and a recent address matching Mrs. Green's house. Marcus still watched her like she might pull a weapon from her threadbare jacket, but he didn't object when James asked him to escort them to the medicinal garden. The late afternoon sun painted the garden in gold and amber. Diane Morrison had designed this space with meticulous care, organizing plants by their traditional uses, culinary herbs near the kitchen garden, aromatic plants around a small meditation area, and medicinal species in raised beds marked with elegant slate labels. James hadn't walked these paths in over a year, and the sight of his wife's creation brought an unexpected sting of tears. Keisha moved through the garden like she was being pulled by invisible threads. She stopped at a bed near the back wall, knelt down despite her pregnant belly, and touched the broad leaves of a plant with stems that bore small, hanging bell-like flowers. The slate marker read, Polygonatum biflorum, Solomon's seal. "This is it," she whispered. "This is exactly what I saw." James crouched beside her, running his fingers over the label his wife had placed there. "Diane planted this 8 years ago. She said it was for nerve health, but I never paid much attention." Keisha moved to another bed, identifying milk thistle with its distinctive purple flowers and white-veined leaves, then to a section of adaptogenic herbs where ashwagandha grew with its small green leaves and orange-red berries. Every plant she described was there, exactly where Diane Morrison had placed them years before her death. "Your wife knew," Keisha said softly. "Maybe not consciously, but some part of her knew. She prepared this for exactly this moment." James sat back on his heels, overwhelmed. Alicia, whom Marcus had wheeled down the stone path, reached out to touch the Solomon seal with reverent fingers. The synchronicity was too precise to dismiss, too layered to be coincidence. His wife's garden, this homeless woman's dreams, his daughter's matching visions, all converging in this impossible moment. "If we do this," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "if we try your remedy, you stay here. Guest house. My staff will make sure you're fed, safe, comfortable. You don't go back to sleeping on the street, especially not pregnant. That's part of the deal." Keisha's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because my wife would have," James replied simply. "And because if there's even a chance you can help my daughter walk, I'll give you whatever you need." Over the next 2 days, Keisha worked in Diane's garden under Marcus's watchful supervision, harvesting roots and preparing the remedy exactly as her inexplicable knowledge dictated. James's personal physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, tested every component, finding them non-toxic but remaining deeply skeptical of their therapeutic value. James also had the mixture analyzed by a laboratory, which confirmed the presence of compounds known to affect neural function but couldn't predict their combined effect. The evening before Alicia was scheduled to begin the treatment, James found Keisha in the guest house, a charming cottage that was nicer than anywhere she'd ever lived. She was sitting by the window, hands on her belly, staring out at the gardens. "Having second thoughts?" James asked from the doorway. Keisha turned, surprised. "I'm terrified I'm wrong, that this won't work and I'll have given you false hope. That's worse than anything else I could do." James entered and sat in the chair across from her. "You know what the worst part of the last 19 years has been. Not the disappointment when treatments failed, not even watching my daughter struggle. It's been the absence of hope. Every doctor, every specialist, they all eventually give you this look that says they've given up. They'll keep trying because I'm paying them, but they don't actually believe anything will work. You're the first person in years who believes. Even if you're wrong, you've given us something precious." "But what if—" Keisha began. "Then we tried," James interrupted. "And that's more than we've been able to say honestly in a long time." The next morning, Alicia took her first dose of the remedy Keisha had prepared. It tasted earthy and slightly bitter, but not unpleasant. Dr. Chen monitored her vitals, finding everything normal. They repeated the dose that evening. Nothing dramatic happened. Alicia felt sleepy but attributed it to the herb's known calming properties. On the third day, Alicia slept for 16 hours straight. Dr. Chen wanted to intervene, but all her vital signs remained stable, her brain activity normal. She appeared to be in a deep, restorative sleep, rather than any kind of medical emergency. James paced the house like a caged animal, while Keisha sat in Alicia's room, maintaining a vigil she couldn't explain but felt compelled to keep. By the fifth day, Alicia was sleeping 20 hours out of 24, rousing only to take her doses and immediately returning to deep slumber. Marcus had increased security, half expecting Keisha to run, but she never left Alicia's side except when James or Dr. Chen insisted. The household staff whispered about witchcraft and madness, but James shut down the gossip with icy efficiency. On the sixth morning, James woke to find Keisha standing in the hallway outside Alicia's room, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he demanded, heart hammering. "What happened?" "Nothing's wrong," Keisha whispered. "She's waking up, and when she does, everything changes." Namei, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of hope, impossibility, and the courage it takes to believe in something beyond explanation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button because we're sharing stories that challenge what you think is possible. Stories about people who refuse to accept the limitations the world places on them. And here's something I want to know. Have you ever followed an instinct that made no logical sense, but turned out to be exactly right? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, and your experiences matter. Sometimes we need to hear that we're not alone in trusting the inexplicable. Now let's see what happens when Alicia finally opens her eyes. Alicia's eyes opened slowly, like someone emerging from a dream so deep it had become its own reality. The morning light filtered through her bedroom curtains, painting everything in soft shades of gold. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, aware that something fundamental had shifted in her body, but unable to name exactly what it was. Then she felt it, a tingling sensation running down her spine, through her hips, branching into her legs like electricity, finding new pathways through long-abandoned wires. James burst into the room with Dr. Chen close behind, both of them wearing expressions caught between terror and desperate hope. Keisha stood near the window, her hand protectively cradling her pregnant belly, watching with an intensity that seemed to hold the entire moment together through sheer force of will. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" James asked, kneeling beside the bed and taking Alicia's hand. "Different," Alicia whispered. "Dad, I can feel my legs. Not just pressure or temperature like before. I can feel them." "Really feel them?" Dr. Chen immediately began a neurological examination, testing reflexes that had been absent for 19 years. When she tapped Alicia's knee, the leg jerked in response. Dr. Chen's professional composure cracked, her eyes widening. She moved to the other leg. Same response. She tested foot flexion, asking Alicia to push against her hand. Alicia's toes moved, then her ankle, then her entire foot pressed against Dr. Chen's palm with unmistakable intention. "This is impossible," Dr. Chen breathed. "According to every test we've ever run, this shouldn't be happening." "Can I try to stand?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling with an emotion too big to contain. James looked at Dr. Chen, who nodded slowly, still in shock. Together they helped Alicia shift to the edge of the bed, her legs hanging over the side. For the first time in her life, Alicia felt the floor beneath her feet, not as distant information her brain registered abstractly, but as real, tangible contact, the cool wood against her soles, the slight pressure as Dr. Chen helped her shift weight onto her legs. "Take it slowly," Dr. Chen cautioned. "Your muscles haven't borne weight in years. They need to remember how." Oh dear, but Alicia's body seemed to have its own understanding, its own memory unlocking like a door that had been sealed but never destroyed. With James on one side and Dr. Chen on the other, Alicia stood. Her legs shook violently from effort and unfamiliarity, but they held. They actually held her weight. Tears streamed down James's face unchecked. All his billionaire composure dissolved in the face of watching his daughter do something he'd been told she would never do. "You're standing, baby. You're standing." Alicia took a breath, focused on her right leg, and shifted her weight forward. Her foot lifted, moved forward 6 inches, and came down again. A step, one actual, real, undeniable step. Then another with the left leg, then another with the right. She was walking, shaky and uncertain and slow, but walking nonetheless across her bedroom floor with her father and her doctor, supporting her, but not carrying her. After crossing 10 feet, Alicia's legs gave out, exhausted from the monumental effort. James caught her, lowering her gently into her wheelchair, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously. Dr. Chen stood frozen, her medical training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "I need to run tests," Dr. Chen said finally. "Full neurological workup, MRI, everything. Because what just happened defies every principle of medicine I understand." Over the next week, Dr. Chen did exactly that. She brought in colleagues from the University of Michigan Medical Center, specialists who'd previously examined Alicia, neurologists who'd declared her case hopeless. The tests revealed neural pathways that had been dormant were now firing with increasing strength, muscle groups rebuilding at an accelerated rate, connections forming that had somehow been blocked before. One neurologist, Dr. Richard Pembroke, who'd examined Alicia 5 years earlier, stood in the Morrison living room, reviewing scans with an expression of complete bafflement. The compounds in that herbal preparation somehow triggered neurogenesis and neural plasticity at levels we typically only see after targeted stem cell therapy. But even that doesn't fully explain the speed of recovery. There's something else happening here, something we don't have instruments sensitive enough to measure. "Does it matter how it happened?" James asked. "It happened. She's walking more every day. Isn't that enough?" Dr. Pembroke looked at Keisha, who sat quietly in the corner, largely ignored by the medical professionals who couldn't quite categorize her role in this miracle. "Where did you learn about this treatment? What research were you following?" "I didn't learn it anywhere," Keisha replied softly. "I just knew it. The same way I knew about Mr. Green's heart. The same way I helped Curtis with his pain. The knowledge just comes when it's needed." The doctors exchanged uncomfortable glances, unable to fit her answer into their framework of evidence-based medicine. But James understood, perhaps because his grandmother Rose had operated from the same inexplicable knowing, perhaps because he'd built a technology empire on the understanding that some innovations arrive fully formed in moments of inspiration that can't be traced to linear research. By the end of the second week, Alicia was walking independently for short distances. By the third week, she walked from her bedroom to the kitchen without assistance. The household staff, who'd initially whispered about Keisha with suspicion and fear, now treated her with reverence tinged with awe. Marcus Bradley, the security chief who'd watched her with hawk-like vigilance, became her unofficial protector, ensuring she had everything she needed. But even as celebration filled the Morrison household, Keisha felt the weight of what came next. She was 7.5 months pregnant, still technically homeless despite James's generosity, and facing the reality that she couldn't stay in the guest house forever. One evening, as she sat in the garden where Diane Morrison's plants had facilitated a miracle, James found her there with the same contemplative expression she'd worn weeks earlier. "You're thinking about leaving," James said, sitting on the stone bench beside her. "I can't stay here indefinitely," Keisha replied. This isn't my life. You've been incredibly kind, but I need to figure out what comes next." James was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "What if I told you that you've already figured it out? You just don't realize it yet. That remedy you created, the knowledge you carry, it could help so many people. My daughter isn't the only person suffering from conditions medicine can't explain or treat. There are thousands, maybe millions, who could benefit from what you know." "I'm not a doctor," Keisha protested. "I don't have training or credentials or—" "You have something more important," James interrupted. "You have genuine healing ability, and I have resources, connections, and a deep desire to honor what you've done for my family. What if we established a foundation? The Keisha Williams Center for Integrative Healing. We'd bring in doctors, researchers, ethnobotanists, people who can help document and validate what you know while respecting where it comes from. You'd help people, and we'd make sure you and your baby are taken care of." Keisha stared at him, overwhelmed. "Why would you do all that?" "Because my daughter is walking," James said simply. "Because you gave us back something we thought was lost forever. Because my wife spent years planting a garden that seemed like a hobby, but turned out to be preparing for exactly this moment. I don't believe in coincidences anymore, Keisha. I believe in purpose, and your purpose is to heal people." 3 months later, the Keisha Williams Center for Integrative Healing opened in a renovated building in downtown Detroit. Keisha had given birth to a healthy baby girl she named Diane, after the woman whose garden had changed everything. James Morrison held a press conference announcing the center and, more importantly, publicly clearing Keisha's name of the accusations that had made her homeless. This young woman was called a witch by people who feared what they didn't understand, James told the assembled media, his voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded billions but was speaking from the heart. She was thrown out, labeled dangerous, treated as cursed. But she isn't any of those things. She's a healer, carrying knowledge that's been dismissed and marginalized for too long. She saved my daughter when the most expensive medical care in the world couldn't. And instead of hiding what she can do, we're going to celebrate it, study it, and make it available to everyone who needs it. The story went viral. News outlets from CNN to the BBC covered it. Medical journals requested permission to study Alicia's case. And most importantly, people started showing up at the center. People with chronic pain, neurological conditions, mysterious ailments that defied conventional diagnosis. Keisha worked with a team of doctors, including Dr. Chen, who'd become a believer in integrative approaches, helping patients in ways that combined her intuitive knowledge with rigorous medical oversight. Mrs. Patricia Green saw the news coverage from her South Side Detroit home. She watched James Morrison describe how Keisha had healed his daughter, watched Keisha holding her baby and looking healthy and confident, watched everything she'd thrown away when she let fear override compassion. The regret tasted like ash in her mouth, but Keisha had moved beyond needing her apology. 6 months after the center opened, Alicia Morrison walked across the stage at her college graduation, something she dreamed of her entire life. Keisha sat in the audience holding baby Diane, with James on one side and Marcus on the other, part of a family she'd never imagined having. When Alicia gave her valedictory address, she spoke about the difference between healing and curing, about miracles that come from the most unexpected sources, about the power of believing in people that society has discarded. "A year ago, I couldn't walk," Alicia told the auditorium full of graduates and families. "Not because my body was broken beyond repair, but because we were looking for answers in the wrong places. It took a homeless woman with a gift she couldn't explain to show us that healing doesn't always come from laboratories and clinical trials. Sometimes it comes from dreams and intuition and knowledge that's been passed down through generations of people whose wisdom was dismissed as superstition. I'm walking today because someone was brave enough to trust what she knew, and my father was brave enough to believe her. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Keisha cried quietly, overwhelmed by how dramatically her life had transformed. From sleeping in doorways to sitting among honored guests at a university graduation, from being called a witch to running a healing center. From being completely alone to having a daughter, a community, and a purpose that gave her life meaning beyond survival. That evening, back at the Morrison estate, where Keisha now lived in a fully renovated guest house that had become her permanent home, James found her in Diane's garden, the place where everything had changed. Baby Diane was asleep in her carrier, and Keisha was tending the Solomon seal that had started it all. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't followed those dreams?" James asked. Keisha smiled, touching the leaves that had carried such power. "Every day. But then I remember that some things are meant to happen, even when they seem impossible. The dreams kept coming because I was supposed to be here. Your wife planted this garden because some part of her knew. Alicia dreamed about me because our paths were meant to cross. None of it makes logical sense, but all of it is true. My grandmother Rose would have loved you," James said softly. "She always said that the world forgets its healers at its own peril." "Then let's make sure the world remembers," Keisha replied, looking out at the garden that had become a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern possibility. Between rejection and redemption, between the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that the world is bigger and more mysterious than our certainties allow, then this channel is your home. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in second chances, in gifts that can't be measured, in the power of refusing to give up on people. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been dismissed or rejected for something that turned out to be your greatest strength? Have you witnessed healing that couldn't be explained? Share your story, because every one of you watching this has experienced something that defies easy explanation, something that reminds us we're living in a world still full of wonder. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that hope isn't foolish, it's essential. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the people the world throws away are exactly the ones who can save us. Did this story change how you think about what's possible? Let me know. I'll see you in the next one.